I'll write this directly. Somewhere in the world right now, a loaf of bread is rising. It's sitting quietly in a warm bowl, covered with a cloth, doing nothing in particular. Or so it looks. But inside, the most patient and unhurried work is going on. Tiny, invisible things are breathing. The dough is slowly, gently swelling the way a chest rises on a long, slow breath. No one needs to watch it. It knows what to do. It has always known what to do. That's the thing about bread. It is one of the oldest foods people have ever made. Long before there were supermarkets, or bakeries on street corners, or ovens in kitchens, people were baking bread. Ancient people. People who lived thousands and thousands of years ago before anyone had written anything down. And somehow, across all that time, the bread has stayed more or less the same. 4 simple things: flour, water, yeast, and salt. That's all. That's nearly all it has ever been. There's something rather wonderful about that, if you let yourself think about it slowly. The same warm smell drifting from a doorway. The same soft, golden crust. The same gentle tug when you pull a piece apart. Generation after generation, all the way back to the very beginning. Let's begin at the beginning then, slowly. There's no hurry at all. It starts in a field. Picture a wheat field on a warm summer day. It stretches out in every direction, gently rippling in the breeze, thousands and thousands of thin green stalks, each one tipped with a little cluster of seeds. Those seeds are called wheat grains, and each one is tiny, about as small as a dried pea, maybe a little smaller, and each one holds everything that bread needs to begin. The wheat grows all spring and most of the summer, drinking in rain and warmth and sunlight. Slowly. Unhurriedly. Fields of wheat are never in a rush. They just grow, a little each day, in that patient way that plants have. When the summer comes to an end and the stalks have turned from green to gold, a warm amber gold, the color of honey in sunlight, the wheat is ready. Farmers bring their great machines through the fields and gather up all those tiny grains, millions and millions of them, and the fields, which were so full and golden just days before, go quiet again, stubble and sky. The grains get taken away and dried and cleaned. And then comes the milling. Milling is the word for grinding. Taking those hard little grains and crushing them, breaking them apart, turning them into something fine and soft and powdery. Flour. You can imagine how it used to be done long ago. Two great flat stones, slowly turning against each other, the grain fed in between them, and out from the sides drifting that fine white dust. It would have smelled faintly sweet, faintly like fresh hay, and the stones would have turned slowly, heavily, doing their steady, unhurried work. These days, mills are very large and use metal rollers instead of stones, but the idea is exactly the same. Grain goes in. Flour comes out. Fine, soft, white, or sometimes a warm pale cream color if a little of the outer husk of the grain is kept in. That's called wholemeal flour or whole grain flour, and it makes bread that's slightly denser, slightly nuttier, slightly the color of a brown paper bag. And that flour gets packed into bags and sent to bakeries and shops and home kitchens, where it waits quietly on shelves and in cupboards until someone decides it's time to make something. Now, here we are in the kitchen. Someone has measured out the flour and tipped it into a bowl. A big, wide bowl with a good, deep curve to it. A comfortable sort of bowl. The kind of bowl you could imagine settling into if you were very small. The flour sits there. It's very light. Even breathing near it makes small clouds of it drift up like smoke and then settle again. Now they add the salt. Just a little, a couple of pinches or a small spoonful. Not enough to taste on its own, not really. But without it, bread tastes flat and a little dull, like something is missing. Salt is one of those quiet things that does its work in the background without drawing attention to itself. And this is the interesting part, the yeast. Yeast is alive. That sounds surprising. It doesn't look alive. It looks like a pale yellow powder, or sometimes it comes as tiny granules, like very fine sand. It sits in a little packet, and it doesn't move, and it doesn't make any sound. But it is alive. It's a living thing, yeast. A very, very tiny living thing. So small that you would need a microscope to see a single one. Billions of them fitting into that little packet. They're a kind of fungus, actually, which is the same family of things that mushrooms belong to. Only much, much smaller than a mushroom. Unimaginably smaller. And they are old. Yeast is one of the oldest living things on Earth. It has been on this planet far, far longer than people have. Far longer. When the first trees were growing, yeast was already there. When the dinosaurs were walking around, yeast was already there, quietly living its tiny, invisible life. Isn't that a funny thought? That something so small and so seemingly unimportant has been here all along. Just waiting, just existing, just going about its ancient, unhurried business. When the yeast is in the packet, it's dormant. That's a word that means something like deeply asleep, still alive, but with everything turned down very low. Waiting. Resting. Patient. The way seeds are patient. But once it touches warm water, not too hot, not too cold, just pleasantly warm, the temperature of a comfortable bath, it wakes up. And when yeast wakes up, it's hungry. The warm water gets added to the bowl. Sometimes a little sugar too, just a tiny amount, because the yeast likes to eat sugar first. It's the quickest and easiest thing for it to find. Someone stirs everything together and then just waits. Just leaves it for a few minutes. And something very quiet begins to happen. The yeast is eating. It's eating the sugars in the flour, the tiny sugars that are locked inside those flour particles. And as it eats, as it digests and processes and goes about its tiny living business, it breathes out a gas. The gas is called carbon dioxide. It's the same gas that we breathe out, actually, the same soft, invisible cloud that rises from our breath on a cold morning. The yeast makes that in enormous quantities, trillions and trillions of tiny bubbles, so small they can't be seen, just felt eventually as the dough becomes lighter and fuller and more alive. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, there's the mixing and kneading. Someone's hands go into the bowl and begin to work the dough together, pulling it into a rough, shaggy ball. At first, it's a bit sticky, a bit lumpy, not very pleasant to handle really. Bits of dry flour still caught in the corners. The dough tears easily. It doesn't hold together well yet. This is where the kneading comes in. Kneading is one of those old kitchen words, and the action itself is ancient. Pushing the heel of the hand into the dough, pressing it forward, folding it back, turning it, pressing again. A rhythm, a slow, repetitive, deeply satisfying rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. What's happening as the dough is kneaded is that long, stretchy strands are being built up inside it. These strands are called gluten. The word might be familiar. People talk about gluten quite a lot these days. But what it actually is a kind of web. A network of very long, very stretchy molecules, all tangled together, running through the dough like the threads in a piece of fabric. when you pull a piece of well-kneaded bread dough, it doesn't just tear. It stretches, gently, a little like very soft, very forgiving rubber. That's the gluten. That's all those long strands pulling taut. And here's why that matters. Remember those bubbles the yeast is going to make? All that carbon dioxide gas, all those tiny invisible breaths? The gluten catches them. The stretchy web of the dough holds the bubbles in place like a net, so they don't just drift away. And as more and more bubbles form, the net stretches just a little to hold them all, and the dough grows bigger and lighter and fuller. The gluten is doing patient work, building the structure, getting ready. After about 10 minutes of kneading, the dough feels different, smooth now, silky almost. It bounces back when you press it with a finger. It's become something. It has a character now, a springiness, a life. Someone shapes it into a round ball and puts it in a bowl and covers it with a cloth and sets it somewhere warm, and then they walk away. Now the dough begins its first long, slow rise. This is called fermentation. Another word that just means the yeast is doing its work, eating and breathing and multiplying. The yeast is very busy now, though you couldn't tell just by looking. The bowl sits still. The cloth drapes over it. The kitchen is quiet. But inside the dough, something extraordinary is happening. The yeast, those billions of tiny living things, each one no bigger than a speck of dust, are eating the sugars in the flour. And as they eat, they're breathing out carbon dioxide endlessly in a constant soft exhalation. Trillions of tiny bubbles forming and floating upward, caught by the stretchy gluten web, held in place. And as the bubbles are caught and held, the dough expands. It grows. Slowly. You can't see it moving, not quite. But if you watched for an hour and then looked away and looked back, you'd notice the dough is bigger. It's swelled up under the cloth, gently, the way bread always has. The first rise usually takes about an hour, sometimes a little longer, and in that time, the dough can double in size. The ball that was about the size of a grapefruit is now the size of a large melon. Full of air, full of tiny trapped bubbles, lighter than it was. It even smells different, slightly sour, slightly alive, faintly sweet. The smell of fermentation, the smell of yeast at work. There's something wonderful about the patience of bread. It cannot be rushed. Not really. You can warm it up a little to hurry things along, but if you try to force it, to bake it before it's had its rise, you end up with something dense and heavy and disappointing. bread that didn't have time to become what it wanted to be. The best bread bakers know this. They know that waiting is part of the work. That sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and let the dough do what it knows how to do, and trust that it will be ready when it's ready. Some bread bakers let their dough rise very slowly, overnight in the fridge at a temperature so cold that the yeast barely wakes up, moving in slow motion. The fermentation goes on for hours and hours and hours. And the bread that comes from that long, slow rise tastes different. More complex, more interesting, with a slightly tangy edge that people find deeply satisfying. Sourdough bread is made this way. It can ferment for 12 hours, 16 hours, even longer. The yeast and the other tiny microbes in the dough taking their time, doing their slow, patient work in the dark. But we don't need to wait 16 hours. An hour will do. The cloth comes off the bowl. The dough has risen beautifully. It sits there, domed and full and slightly quivering, like a very calm, contented thing. The baker looks at it for a moment. It's always a satisfying sight. Something that was nothing an hour ago is now full of potential. Now comes what's called the knockback, or the punch down. Which sounds rather dramatic, but is actually very gentle. Just pressing the dough down, pushing the air out, feeling it deflate under the hands with a slow, soft sigh. All those bubbles pressed out, all that work seemingly undone. But it isn't undone. The gluten is stronger now than it was before. The yeast is more evenly distributed through the dough, and the flavor has deepened a little. The knockback is actually important. It helps the bread develop better in the end. You have to press it down before it can rise again. Isn't that a nice thought? Sometimes you have to gently let the air out before something can fill up properly. The dough is shaped now. This is a satisfying part, folding and tucking it into its final form. A round loaf, perhaps, smooth on top and gathered at the bottom, or a long loaf, a baguette shape, rolled and tapered. Or pressed into a tin, squared off at the sides. The sort of loaf that makes neat rectangular slices, good for toast. Whatever shape it takes, it gets put somewhere warm again, covered again, and it rests again. This second rise is called the proof. It takes less time than the first rise. Half an hour, maybe a little more. The yeast is very awake now, very active, doing the last of its work before the oven, and the dough rises again. Quietly, patiently, just as it always has. The oven is heating. This is important. The oven has to be very hot before the bread goes in, much hotter than you might expect. 200 degrees or more. That's hot enough to make water boil away in seconds, hot enough that you can feel it radiating out even before you open the door. A dry, steady, serious heat. Some bread bakers, especially those who make the kind of bread with a thick, crackly crust, put a tray of water in the bottom of the oven first. The water turns to steam and fills the oven with warm, moist air. And that steam, in the first few minutes of baking, does something important. It keeps the outside of the bread soft and stretchable just a little longer so the dough can expand fully before the crust hardens. Because here's what happens when bread meets heat. It grows. One last time, and quickly. The yeast has a sudden burst of activity in the first heat of the oven, eating faster, breathing out more carbon dioxide, sending those bubbles rushing through the dough in a final flurry of work. And then, when the temperature gets high enough, the yeast dies. Its work is done. It gave everything it had. The bubbles are still there, though, locked into the bread now because the gluten has hardened around them. If you looked at a slice of bread, really looked at it carefully, you'd see all those little holes, those tiny irregular pockets. Every one of them is a bubble that the yeast made. A tiny breath, preserved forever in the crumb of the loaf. Can you imagine that? Every single hole in bread is a little bubble of breath. The bread is full of tiny frozen moments, tiny little sighs, all held still. The bread goes into the oven. Before it does, a baker might score the top of the loaf, draw a sharp knife or a blade across it in a deliberate pattern, a single slash or two crossed lines, or a leaf pattern, delicate and deliberate. This scoring isn't just for looks, though it does look lovely. It has a purpose. As the bread expands in the oven, it needs somewhere to open up and breathe. Without scoring, it might burst randomly, tearing wherever the pressure finds a weak spot. The scoring guides it, invites it to open in a particular direction, like a flower deciding where to bloom. The oven door closes. Now the slow transformation begins. In the first 10 minutes or so, the bread is still rising. That last yeasty burst called oven spring. The loaf visibly swells and settles into its final shape. If you peered through the oven window, you'd see the scored lines opening up, widening, revealing a paler, softer interior as the bread pushes through. Then the crust begins to form. The outside of the bread, exposed directly to that dry, serious heat, begins to dry out and harden. The water inside it evaporates. The sugars in the flour, the very same sugars, the yeast was eating earlier begin to do something else, entirely under high heat. They brown. This process has a name. It's called the Maillard reaction, after a French scientist who described it about 100 years ago. It's what happens to food when it goes from pale to golden under heat. The sugars and proteins doing a complicated little chemical dance that turns them brown and creates hundreds of different flavor compounds all at once. It's what makes toast taste different from bread, what makes the crust taste different from the soft interior. All those warm, complex, slightly sweet, and slightly savory notes. They all come from the Maillard reaction happening in the oven. And the smell. The smell of bread baking is one of the oldest and most comforting smells in the world. And it comes from exactly this. From the crust, browning, from those sugar molecules turning and changing in the heat, releasing compounds that drift into the air and float through the kitchen and out under doors and through windows. There's a reason people say that smell makes a house feel like a home. It's ancient, that association. Bread baking means warmth, means safety, means nourishment. People have been responding to that smell for thousands of years. Long before anyone understood why, they simply felt, somewhere deep and wordless, that everything was all right. The loaf bakes for about half an hour, sometimes 40 minutes for a larger loaf. Toward the end, the crust is deep gold, almost amber at the edges. The scored lines have opened up beautifully, their edges darker than the rest. The kitchen smells overwhelmingly of warm bread. Sweet and yeasty and slightly nutty all at once. The baker opens the oven door and takes the loaf out on a rack or a tray, and there it is. Golden, solid, done. There's one test a baker might do. They pick up the loaf, carefully, it's very hot, and tap the bottom of it. If it makes a hollow sound, like tapping an empty box, the bread is done all the way through. If it sounds dull and dense, it needs a few more minutes. That hollow sound means the inside of the loaf is set. The bubbles are fixed in place. The crumb. That's the word for the soft inside of the bread. Has cooked through, the wet doughy flour transformed into something dry and light and open. A structure of tiny rooms and corridors and pockets of air, all held together by the gluten, now firm and permanent. The loaf goes onto a wire rack to cool. And now comes the hardest part of all. Waiting. The bread needs to cool before it's cut. This is very hard advice to follow. The smell is extraordinary. The loaf is sitting right there. But if you cut into hot bread too soon, the interior hasn't finished setting. It can collapse, become gummy, lose the perfect open crumb that all that careful work produced. So the bread sits, steaming very faintly, cooling slowly from the outside in. The crust, which was soft just after baking, begins to harden as it cools, and sometimes makes small crackling sounds. Tiny adjustments as it contracts and settles. Like a house settling at night, making its small sounds in the dark. That crackling is a lovely sound. Quiet and domestic and peaceful. The sound of something finishing. After an hour or so, the bread is ready. Someone takes a bread knife. One of those long knives with a wavy, serrated edge that lets it move through the crust without crushing the soft crumb below, and makes the first cut. There it is. The crumb. Cream-colored, lightly glossy where the cut surface catches the light. Full of those little holes, those tiny preserved breaths of yeast. Some holes bigger, some smaller, scattered unevenly like a small aerial map of some soft, pale landscape. The first slice is the best. Still slightly warm. The crust shattering gently under the knife. The crumb pulling away cleanly. And if someone puts a little butter on it, real butter, which is cold and pale yellow and makes a faint scraping sound as it drags across the warm bread. The butter begins to melt almost immediately, soaking into all those little holes, disappearing into all those tiny frozen yeast breaths, turning the pale crumb slightly translucent. That bread, that moment, is thousands of years old. The wheat and the water and the salt and the yeast, the kneading and the rising and the baking. It has been happening just like that, more or less, since before history began. People in ancient Egypt made bread. People in ancient Greece. People in cold northern forests and hot southern deserts and river valleys all over the world, all doing more or less the same slow, patient thing. There's a word for things that have been with us so long, they feel like home. Bread is one of those things. Let's go back to the yeast for a moment. It deserves a little more attention. Those tiny living things that breathe carbon dioxide and make bread rise. They don't only live in packets on shelves. Wild yeast lives everywhere. It floats in the air. It lives on the skins of fruit. It lives in the soil. Billions of years of yeast, just floating and waiting, as it always has. When flour is mixed with water and left out in the open air, wild yeast from all around, from the room, from the baker's hands, from the air drifting through a window, begins to settle into the mixture. To wake up. To eat. This is how sourdough starter is made, and it's the oldest form of leavening, of bread raising, there is. Long before anyone understood what yeast was or knew it was alive, people kept sourdough starters. A little blob of fermented flour and water, fed with fresh flour each day, teeming with wild yeast and other tiny organisms, kept alive for years and years. Some sourdough starters are very old. There are bakeries that have starters they've kept going for 100 years, for 50 years. Bakers who carefully took their starter with them when they moved, or kept a little of it in the fridge as a backup, just in case. The wild yeast in those starters has been alive continuously for decades. Eating. Breathing. Patient as anything. The bread made from a long-kept sourdough starter tastes of all those years. Not literally. Not obviously. But there's a depth and complexity to it that comes from the particular mix of microbes that have built up over time in that specific starter, in that specific kitchen, with that specific baker's hands. Every sourdough is, in a way, a local bread, made with the air and the flour and the water of one place. A little portrait of where it came from. Isn't that a rather lovely thought? That bread can be a place. And then there are all the different kinds of bread. Flatbreads, thin and unleavened, made without any yeast at all, pressed onto a hot stone or pan and cooked in minutes. Chapati. Tortilla. Flatbread. These are probably the oldest kind of all, made before anyone discovered fermentation. Simple, quick, good. Bread with seeds scattered on top. Poppy seeds, sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, each one adding a tiny nutty crunch to the crust. Bread with rosemary pressed into the surface, or olives folded into the dough, or the sweet dark crinkle of dried fruit running through a rich, tender loaf. Brioche. Rich French bread made with eggs and butter, soft and golden yellow inside, more like cake than bread, tender in a way that ordinary bread isn't. The kind of bread that dissolves gently on the tongue. Rye bread, dense and dark, made from rye flour instead of wheat, with a strong, slightly sour flavor and a closeness to it, a tightness that speaks of cold northern winters and ancient forests. Focaccia. Flat Italian bread pressed into a pan with olive oil, dimpled all over with fingertips before baking, scattered with salt and perhaps rosemary or sliced olives, its top golden and shining. Each one different. Each one made from the same simple idea. Flour, water, something to make it rise, and heat. The warmth is important. It comes up again and again in bread. The warmth of the water to wake the yeast, the warmth of a kitchen to help the dough rise, the warmth of an oven to bake it through. Even the warmth of hands, kneading the dough, matters a little. Cold hands slow things down, Warm hands keep the dough at the right temperature. Bread is a warm thing in every sense. It wants warmth to become itself, and warmth is what it gives back. A loaf of bread just out of the oven radiates heat. You can feel it from a foot away. And the eating of warm bread, the way it's warm all the way through, the way holding a piece of it is actually something like holding something living. That warmth is real. It was captured from the oven, stored in the crumb, and it releases slowly as the bread cools. There's that image again. Something patient. Something that collects warmth and holds it quietly and gives it back in its own time. Somewhere in the world right now, bread is cooling on a rack. It's making tiny sounds. That soft crackling of the crust contracting in the air. No one might be in the room. The kitchen might be empty and quiet, just the hum of something electrical, the sound of settling. And in the bread, all those tiny holes, all those little frozen breaths from all those tiny living things are simply there, the way they always have been. Patient. Still. Part of something that has been going on for thousands and thousands of years without stopping. It's a simple thing. Bread. 4 ingredients. A little warmth, a little time. And it contains in its crumb the breathing of living things too small to see. The work of grain fields that rippled in a summer wind. The long, slow chemistry of yeast, eating and breathing and multiplying in the dark. The patient development of gluten, strand by strand, stretch by stretch, building something that can hold all those tiny breaths together. It's such a quiet thing to do, such a slow, gentle, unhurried thing. The dough doesn't know it's being watched. The yeast doesn't know anything at all, not in the way we understand knowing. They just do what they've always done. Eat a little, breathe a little, grow. And out of that, bread. Warm and golden and full of tiny rooms. Thousands of years of warm and golden and full of tiny rooms. Sometimes, when things feel like too much, or the day was very full, it helps to think about something quiet and slow and ancient, like bread. To think about a field of wheat standing still in late summer, stems bent a little in a warm wind, the grain heavy and golden. To think about flour falling through the air like the softest snow. To think about a small living thing, too small to see, waking up in warm water and beginning its patient, endless, important work. There's nothing urgent about bread. Nothing that needs deciding. It just goes on, the way it always has. Rising and falling and rising again, patient as the seasons, patient as fields. The dough is in the bowl somewhere, covered. Still. And inside it, something very small is breathing, slowly, again and again in the warm dark, in and out, in and out. The bread will be ready in the morning.